The foundational history of the Duchy of Bavaria is geographically inseparable from its strategic position along the Great European Divide, a nexus where the central power structures of the West invariably collided with the mobile cultures of the East. This geopolitical role was not accidental. It was dictated by the unique structure of the landscape itself. The northern face of the Eastern Alps presented a formidable, yet permeable, natural boundary, creating a buffer state between the Italian peninsula and the northern plains. Crucially, the Danube River, often perceived as a mere waterway, functioned historically as a military and commercial highway, channeling successive waves of migration, trade, and imperial ambition directly through the region's heart. For over 4 centuries, this area operated as the northern extension of Roman civilization, primarily organized under the provinces of Raetia and Noricum. Roman control was predicated on maintaining the integrity of the Danubian limes, a sophisticated system of forts, watchtowers, and roads designed to regulate movement across the riverline. The administrative infrastructure was anchored by major settlements such as Castra Regina, Regensburg, and Augusta Vindelicorum, Augsburg, the latter serving as the provincial capital of Raetia Secunda. These urban centres were not simply military garrisons. They were highly organized hubs of Roman provincial life, facilitating the Romanization of the indigenous Celtic population and managing extensive agricultural estates and resource extraction operations. The economic significance of the area extended far beyond farming. The control of vital alpine passes paths that channeled essential goods, troops, and political influence between Italy and Germania was an enduring asset. Furthermore, local industries, particularly the production of salt from sites like Reichenhall, provided a consistent source of wealth and strategic leverage. These Roman roads, notably the Via Claudia Augusta, knit the region together, ensuring rapid military response and commercial efficiency. The enduring presence of this infrastructure, even after Rome's direct administrative capacity waned, became the inheritance upon which all subsequent Germanic rulers would build their power base. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. By the 5th century, the density of Roman military and bureaucratic structures began to thin, a process known to historians as recession rather than immediate collapse. Roman units, increasingly composed of Germanic foederati or allied troops, frequently withdrew to address crises elsewhere, leaving behind a semi-Romanized population known as the Romano-Celtic substrate. These abandoned military installations, the castra and castella, became points of gravitational attraction for incoming groups of Germanic peoples who valued the existing fortifications and the superior building materials. The confluence of the Inn and Isar rivers formed the natural geographic core for the later duchy, defining a fertile, defensible region ideal for settlement. This area, bordered by the hostile, forested territory of the Bohemian Massif to the northeast and the volatile Pannonian Plain to the east, was permanently destined to serve as a frontier, a marchland. It was a zone of relentless cultural fusion and military tension, where the layers of Celtic tradition, Roman administration, and new Germanic bloodlines would ultimately precipitate the birth of a new political identity. This landscape was therefore not merely the backdrop for the Duchy of Bavaria, but the structural, economic, and strategic reason for its existence, setting the historical constraints that would dictate its foreign policy and domestic structure for the next millennium. The last decades of the 5th century witnessed the official cessation of imperial governance in the lands north of the main mountain chains, a decisive moment marking the shift from classical antiquity to the early Middle Ages. This was not a consequence of catastrophic military defeat, but rather a phased strategic disengagement driven by the West's diminishing resources and its dire need for troop consolidation in the vital Italian peninsula. The formal dissolution of the civil bureaucracy meant that established mechanisms for justice, tax collection, and public works maintenance structures that had organized life for generations simply ceased to function. The once dependable flow of Roman coinage dried up, forcing a rapid reversion to localized agrarian economies and barter, fundamentally altering trade dynamics across the vast territory. The military units garrisoned along the Great Northern Artery had, for decades, been largely comprised of Germanic mercenaries and settlers, operating under the federate system. These troops, whose primary allegiance was often personal or local rather than imperial, simply remained in place once their contracts and pay vanished. Their enduring presence, often centered on the former fortifications, maintained a residual military structure but entirely lacked central oversight, thereby creating numerous small, independent centers of martial power. The massive villa estates, which had formed the backbone of the provincial economy, quickly fell into disuse. Though the stone and mortar structures remained, the complex supply chains and labor organizations necessary to sustain them collapsed, forcing the population back into more dispersed, self-sufficient hamlets. Into this fractured post-imperial environment migrated several distinct groups that would eventually contribute to a new regional identity. The Rugi, having been defeated and displaced from the middle river course to the east, sought refuge and permanent settlement in these richer lands, bringing their distinct political traditions and material culture. Archaeological evidence attests to the simultaneous arrival of various groups identified in historical texts as Marcomanni and isolated contingents of Ostrogoths, movements often tolerated or encouraged by the retreating Roman authorities themselves as a means of managing pressure. These newcomers did not sweep away the existing inhabitants, but instead integrated into the socio-economic framework alongside the established Romance-speaking farmers and artisans. The enduring cultural inheritance was significant. While the Latin language of administration and high culture decayed, a vulgar Latin dialect persisted among the river valley communities, particularly those associated with the former trade hubs. Furthermore, the knowledge of masonry, tile-making, and road construction superior technologies that defined the Roman period was retained by local craftsmen and became an asset to the emerging Germanic leadership. This unique socio-political vacuum, characterized by the absence of an emperor, but the persistence of Roman physical remnants and Latin cultural echoes, was precisely what enabled the formation of a new, cohesive socio-military aristocracy centered on localized defense and control of remaining resources. This amalgamation of fragmented tribes, rooted provincials, and retained military assets became the essential precondition for the development of the Bavaria. The period following the retreat of the imperial administrative structures witnessed a profound process of ethnogenesis within the former frontier provinces, culminating in the appearance of the Bavaria. This emergent people, unique among the post-Roman successor entities, did not claim identity through a shared memory of a distant migration from a northern homeland. Rather, their collective character was forged in situ, a direct product of cohabitation and necessity. By the early 6th century, archaeological analysis reveals a distinctive and standardized material culture across the territories between the Lech and the Enns. This new cultural stratum, observable in burial practices and domestic production, indicates the successful fusion of multiple contributing elements. The settled provincials, descendants of the original inhabitants and the Romanized populations, provided continuity in agricultural methods and local governance. The incoming Germanic fragments, those who had sought refuge from the chaos farther east, contributed martial traditions and novel forms of Germanic political organization. Crucially, the external political landscape of the 500 seconds was dominated by the Ostrogothic kingdom of Theodoric the Great, whose vast authority extended from Italy and the Adriatic deep into this northern sphere. Evidence suggests that the consolidation of disparate groups into a single, recognized entity may have been directly facilitated by Theodoric's administration. The Ostrogoths imposed a strategic military order on the unstable former provinces, establishing a recognized line of authority to ensure frontier security and manage trade along the remaining logistical arteries. It is likely that the designation Baiuvari, meaning men from Bohemia or men of the Boii, Referencing the adjacent territory was applied to this new grouping by an external power, defining them by their geographic location rather than their ancestry. Linguistically, this era marks the decisive transition from the persisting Latin vernacular to an early form of Old High German. Although Latin remained important for ecclesiastical and formal communications, the common spoken tongue of the New Bavaria was Germanic, serving as a unifying force across the mixed population base. The subsequent codification of law, specifically the Lex Baiuvariorum in the 8th century, though drawing on much earlier customs, provides the definitive retrospective evidence for this identity. This legal text meticulously details the social stratification of the people, distinguishing between the hereditary nobility, the free commoners, and the various groups of unfree or dependent labourers, thereby legally validating their existence as a cohesive ethnic and social body. The military character of the Bavaria was fundamentally rooted in their continuous need for self-defense. Positioned at the juncture of the hostile Slavic world to the east and the ambitious Frankish kingdom to the west, military service was compulsory and decentralized, forming the true basis of the nascent Bavarian aristocratic structure. This necessity for defense required a singular political voice, leading directly to the establishment of the first ducal authority. Historical texts point to the early 6th century installation of a duke, marking the transition from an informal military alliance of settlements to a formally governed duchy, recognized and often contested by the surrounding greater powers. This political organization cemented the existence of the Bavaria on the European map as a permanent fixture. The crystallization of Bavarian political identity around the middle of the 6th century is marked by the establishment of the Agilolfing dynasty. This lineage provided the first sustained ducal authority over the newly identified Bavaria. Their emergence as rulers was neither purely indigenous nor fully elective, but rather a functional development sanctioned by the dominant power in Western Europe, the Merovingian Franks. The earliest known duke associated with this family is Garibold I, whose rule is conventionally placed around 550 AD. This initial appointment served a dual purpose for the Frankish kings. It placed a reliable singular figure in charge of a complex and strategically vital frontier, and it formalized a subordinate relationship without the necessity of expensive direct military occupation. The Agilolfing's power base was initially centered near Regensburg, Ratisbona, the former Roman Castra Regina. This location was chosen for its unparalleled logistical advantages, sitting at the head of navigation on the Danube and possessing intact Roman fortifications. The ducal authority was not absolute, but was recognized as supreme within the duchy's shifting boundaries, which encompassed the lands between the Lech River in the west and the Enns River to the east, including the major Alpine routes. Their governance was conducted not through a developed royal court, but by exercising military ban the right to levy troops and presiding over assemblies of the local Bavarian aristocracy. This nobility consisted of powerful established families like the Harhilinga and the Huosi, whose support was essential for the duke's legitimacy and stability. This early ducal era was defined by delicate diplomatic maneuvering. The Agilolfings were required to swear formal allegiance, fidelitas, to the Merovingian throne, supplying military contingents for Frankish campaigns. However, they consistently used the geographical distance and the frequent internal dynastic conflicts within the Merovingian realm to assert practical autonomy. A key foreign policy instrument was marriage. The early dukes sought marital alliances with other Germanic peoples, most notably the Lombards in Italy. These southern connections were economically and militarily significant, allowing the Bavarians to operate as an independent power broker across the Alps, frequently to the chagrin of their Frankish overlords. The codification of native law, known later as the Lex Baiuvariorum, began under Agilolfing patronage, although its final form postdates the dynasty. This legal project was a crucial tool of state building, giving the Bavaria a recognized legal identity and establishing the hereditary privileges of the nobility, thereby legitimizing the duke's authority as the head of a structured, functional society. Thus, the Agilolfing rise transformed Bavaria from a loose collection of tribal fragments into a genuine nascent political unit, a powerful, self-aware duchy whose political identity was permanently secured, despite its formal, tenuous relationship with the sprawling Frankish kingdom, for approximately 200 years. From the mid-6th through the mid-8th centuries, the Dukes of Bavaria, operating from their political centre at Regensburg, maintained a complex and highly conditional subordination to the dominant Merovingian dynasty. This relationship defined the duchy's early foreign policy. While the Agilolfings formally recognized the ultimate authority of the Frankish kings, this acknowledgement was largely symbolic and strategic, cemented by regular, though often reluctant, oaths of loyalty and the requirement to supply military contingents, exercitus biuvariorum, for Merovingian campaigns, particularly those targeting the Slavic and Avar frontiers. The true source of Bavarian ducal autonomy lay in the persistent fragmentation of the greater Frankish kingdom. Merovingian power was repeatedly fractured by endemic dynastic feuding between the sub-kingdoms of Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy. The resulting internal conflicts absorbed the attention and military resources of the central royal house, preventing any sustained, systematic attempt to impose tight administrative control over the distant Bavarian periphery. The dukes shrewdly exploited this geographical and political distance, focusing their efforts on the internal consolidation of power. This period saw the Agilolfings engage in a determined effort to extend their effective control over the local Bavarian aristocracy, a process essential for state building. Dukes governed by presiding over the National Assembly or Thing, where major legal and military decisions were ratified and the loyalty of the powerful noble clans was secured. The duchy's stability during the 7th and early 8th centuries was also ensured by its military utility. It functioned as the crucial Frankish buffer state against the formidable threat of the Avars, a nomadic cavalry power entrenched in the Pannonian plain. The Bavarians consistently bore the primary defence burden along this eastern flank, a costly service that enhanced their prestige and solidified their indispensable role within the Frankish sphere. Furthermore, the ducal house pursued ambitious, independent foreign diplomacy that often contravened Merovingian interests. The enduring marital connection with the Lombards was a core strategic element, binding the Bavarian elite to the royal house in northern Italy. This relationship facilitated the secure passage of goods and ideas across the Alps, establishing the Agilolfings as key geopolitical intermediaries and allowing them access to Italian wealth and political intelligence. This network was so firmly established that the dukes often acted as fully independent sovereigns, initiating military actions and signing treaties without formal Frankish consultation or approval. The zenith of this autonomy, before the rise of the Carolingians, showcased a powerful, self-governing entity defined by its shrewd management of allegiance and its secure frontier defence. The Agilolfing Duke's strategic orientation was fundamentally focused on expansion beyond the established northern boundaries of the duchy, driven by dual impulses, securing critical trade routes and preempting encroachment by hostile neighbours. This policy of territorial aggrandizement led to sustained efforts to assert authority over the mountainous regions to the south and the Slavic-populated territories to the east. The primary objective was control of the Alpine routes necessary for commercial and political intercourse with the Kingdom of the Lombards in Italy. In the south, Bavarian influence successfully penetrated and stabilized the region that would later be known as South Tyrol, modern Trentino Alto Adige. This mountainous zone was crucial because it contained the key passes, such as the Brenner Pass, which served as the most direct link between the Danube Valley and the northern Italian plains. By establishing firm control over these choke points, the dukes not only regulated the flow of Alpine commerce, including salt, metals, and textiles, but also guaranteed the security of their vital marital and diplomatic ties to the Lombard royal house. This southward projection of power was based on the establishment of ducally sponsored settlements and the imposition of a military presence to ensure safe transit, thereby asserting sovereign rights over the territory. Simultaneously, the duchy directed its military and administrative energy eastward into Carantania, roughly corresponding to modern-day Carinthia and Styria. This area was predominantly settled by Slavic tribes who had migrated westward following the collapse of the Avar Khaganate's military strength. The initial Bavarian movement into Carantania was often a response to pleas for military protection from the local Slavic leadership, who sought assistance against the lingering Avar threat, or from neighbouring, aggressive Slavic groups. This dynamic allowed the Agilolfings to install Bavarian counts, Grafen, or governors in the region, effectively bringing the Slavic inhabitants into the ducal sphere of influence under a conditional form of subordinate governance. This eastern expansion transformed the duchy into a state with composite ethnic jurisdiction. While the core territory remained overwhelmingly Germanic, the eastern marches were governed indirectly, often through local Slavic chiefs who owed tribute and provided military service to Regensburg. This system of managing a foreign, newly Christianizing, subject population was critical for creating a reliable defense-in-depth buffer against incursions further east. Thus, the southern and eastern initiatives were not mere land grabs. They were highly calculated geopolitical moves that secured the duchy's economic viability through control of transalpine connectivity and provided essential strategic depth against the volatile Pannonian frontier. The result was a significantly enlarged, more complex, and internationally recognized political entity ready to play a major role in the emerging continental order. The religious evolution of the Bavarian duchy was a critical component of its political development, operating as a strategic endeavor sponsored by the ducal house to enhance its legitimacy. The establishment of Christianity did not proceed through formal Roman missionization, which had vanished, but through the efforts of dedicated, small-scale peregrinating missionaries. These figures were primarily drawn from the Hiberno-Scottish tradition, Irish and Anglo-Saxon monks, and the adjacent Frankish monastic centres. They introduced the Christian faith not only to the rural population but, more importantly, to the ducal court and the local aristocracy. This ducal patronage was instrumental. The Agilolfing rulers directly supported the founding of monasteries across the duchy, such as those at Salzburg, Freising, and Passau. These institutions rapidly evolved beyond centres of spiritual contemplation. They became vital centres of literacy, administration, and land development. By granting vast tracts of uncultivated or newly conquered land to these ecclesiastical foundations, the dukes effectively subsidized the clearing of forests, the organization of agriculture, and the settlement of populations in key areas, simultaneously expanding the ducal economy and securing loyal, non-hereditary power bases. The adoption of the Catholic faith by the ducal elite conferred a new dimension of political consecration. It provided the Agilolfings with a theological foundation for their authority, shifting the basis of their rule from mere martial dominance to divinely sanctioned sovereignty. This religious legitimacy was essential for dealing with the established Christian monarchies of Europe, granting the dukes an equal status in diplomatic communication and treaty-making with the Franks and the Lombards. However, this reliance on the church was inherently a double-edged sword. While the ducal house funded and promoted religious growth, the church in Bavaria nominally fell under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Frankish archbishops, specifically the Metropolitan See of Mainz. This relationship created perpetual, intense conflicts over episcopal appointments, taxation of church property, and the ultimate spiritual governance of the duchy. The Frankish hierarchy viewed the Bavarian church as subordinate, while the dukes fought fiercely to maintain the independence of their newly established bishoprics, installing their own loyal candidates and effectively controlling the massive wealth generated by the monastic estates. The struggle was not theological, but institutional. It was a ceaseless political contest between the ducal family and the Frankish political ecclesiastical machine over the effective sovereignty, the potestas within the duchy's borders. Thus, the spread of Christianity, while solidifying the Bavarian identity, simultaneously elevated the severity of the confrontation with the neighbouring Frankish kingdom. The history of the first ducal line culminated under the long, ambitious reign of Duke Tassilo III, who transformed the conditional autonomy previously enjoyed by the Agilolfings into a declaration of de facto sovereignty. Tassilo inherited the duchy during a period of complex transition, having been placed in power while still a minor under the regency of his father's successor in the Frankish palace, Pepin the Short. This initial close relationship with the rising Carolingian dynasty quickly dissolved as Tassilo matured and sought to eliminate all external constraints on his rule. His strategy for asserting independence was multifaceted, concentrating on religious, military, and diplomatic levers. Tassilo meticulously focused on reforming and expanding the Bavarian ecclesiastical structure, securing its loyalty directly to the ducal throne rather than to the Frankish metropolitan sees. The Duke's sponsorship of important foundations like the monastery of Kremsmünster and the Abbey of Innichen was not merely pious. These institutions became major landholders, centres of ducal administration, and strategic fortifications along the vulnerable eastern and southern frontiers. This direct control over the Church's vast wealth and manpower ensured that spiritual authority supported secular power. Tassilo's most provocative and ultimately fatal diplomatic maneuver was his cultivation of an independent, anti-Frankish foreign policy. He renewed and solidified the ancient alliance with the Lombards in Italy through marriage and political agreement, directly contradicting the emerging strategic goals of Pepin and, later, Charlemagne. Furthermore, he engaged in major independent military campaigns against the Slavs in Carantania, successfully expanding and stabilizing the Eastern March. This campaign success allowed Tassilo to establish the March of Friuli, demonstrating his capacity to act as a sovereign power and extending his sphere of influence without any consultation with the Frankish royal court. The minting of his own silver coinage, an essential attribute of independent rule, further underscored his claims. The turning point came when Charlemagne decisively defeated the Lombard kingdom in 774, eliminating Bavaria's primary strategic ally and leaving Tassilo geographically isolated. Despite having sworn renewed fidelity to the Carolingian king at the field of Lech in 781, Tassilo was systematically stripped of his political leverage. His continued refusal to provide full military service to the Frankish crown and his sustained diplomatic independence were viewed by Charlemagne as blatant acts of treachery. The Frankish king, now master of the entire central continent, possessed the necessary military superiority and political will to end the decades-long issue of Bavarian autonomy. Tassilo's defiance, while glorious in scope, made him the final, inevitable target of the Carolingian drive for continental unification. The confrontation between the Duchy of Bavaria and the Frankish crown moved inexorably toward a resolution dictated by Charlemagne's singular vision of a unified Western Empire. Following the Frankish conquest of the Kingdom of the Lombards in 774, which eliminated Duke Tassilo III's only powerful continental ally, Bavaria was entirely enveloped by Carolingian power. Charlemagne's approach to eliminating this final pocket of autonomy was systematic, utilizing a combination of legal procedures, ecclesiastical pressure, and overwhelming military force. The primary mechanism for Tassilo's undoing was the charge of feudal disloyalty, Felonia, specifically his previous refusal to fulfill his military obligations to the Frankish king. Charlemagne methodically orchestrated a series of judicial assemblies beginning in 787 AD. At the Diet of Worms, Tassilo was effectively put on trial by his peers, the Frankish and allied nobility, who were eager to see the last great independent ducal line removed. The evidence presented focused on documented acts of insubordination, including the Duke's independent diplomatic activities and the perceived breach of his sworn allegiance. When Tassilo initially refused to appear, Charlemagne launched a three-pronged military invasion of the duchy, mobilizing forces to converge on the Bavarian heartland from three different directions: the north, the west, and the recently conquered Italian south. This sheer show of force was designed to crush any potential military resistance instantly and decisively, undermine the political will of the local Bavarian nobility, who could not afford to risk their estates in a hopeless conflict against the Carolingian war machine. Faced with this overwhelming concentration of power, Tassilo chose submission over annihilation, meeting Charlemagne at Lechfeld near Augsburg, where he formally renewed his oaths of vassalage and surrendered hostages, including his son. This submission, however, was only a temporary measure for Charlemagne. The final political destruction of the Agilolfing line was executed the following year at the Council of Ingelheim in 788 AD. Here, Tassilo was again formally tried and convicted of high treason, a sentence secured by testimony from disaffected Bavarian nobles and Frankish loyalists. The immediate consequence was the permanent deposition of Tassilo III from his ducal office. His final humiliating fate was forced tonsure, transforming him from a powerful secular ruler into a powerless monk, and eliminating the possibility of an hereditary challenge to Frankish rule. His family was also sequestered in religious institutions to prevent the continuation of the dynastic threat. The deposition of Tassilo allowed Charlemagne to abolish the distinct Agilolfing tribal duchy as a political entity. The Carolingian administration immediately dissolved the ducal authority, annexing the territory and reorganizing it as a series of integrated counties, Gau, governed directly by Frankish counts, Grafen, or thoroughly vetted local officials. This was the decisive act that fully incorporated the Bavarian lands into the larger, centralized structure of the Carolingian Empire, fundamentally ending the unique political autonomy enjoyed by the First Bavarian state for over 2 centuries. The political demise of Duke Tassilo III in 788 AD served as a stark and irreversible statement on the nature of authority in the burgeoning Carolingian Empire. This final, humiliating act, the forced deposition and removal of a long-established hereditary ruler, was a precedent-setting exercise in power consolidation that redefined the relationship between the central Frankish monarch and the periphery. The ultimate spectacle of Tassilo's end, which saw him stripped of his ducal robes and forced to take monastic vows, was a public, non-lethal execution of his political identity, designed to render him permanently ineligible to rule or pass on claims to his descendants. This religious humiliation was strategically preferable to simple execution, lending the whole affair an air of righteous, Christian purification rather than mere bloody conquest. Tassilo was officially confined to the Abbey of Jumièges and later St. Emmeram in Regensburg, effectively becoming a political prisoner. His children were similarly institutionalized, neutralizing the entire Agilolfing dynasty as a dynastic threat. This act of permanent dynastic liquidation demonstrated Charlemagne's intolerance for any lingering sense of tribal independence, Stammesherzogtum, that predated his continental dominion. The message broadcast across the European political landscape was clear. The Carolingian model demanded direct, unquestioning subordination, not autonomous vassalage. The immediate consequence for the former ducal territory was its complete administrative dissolution. Charlemagne chose not to appoint a new duke, but rather annexed the entire region, integrating it fully into the Frankish system of counties. Gau. The vast lands that were previously governed by the duke were seized as royal domain, fiscus, providing the Frankish king with immense new economic resources and direct control over the Alpine routes and trading centres. Governance was entrusted to a network of Frankish counts, Grafen, often drawn from families personally loyal to the Carolingian house. These officials were granted specific judicial and military mandates, but lacked the hereditary authority or regional political foundation necessary to challenge the central throne. Crucially, Charlemagne maintained the area as a highly militarized frontier, continuing its necessary role as the Eastern March, Ostmark. However, the military focus shifted. It was no longer a Bavarian defense, but an imperial one, centrally directed and manned by Frankish resources. Charlemagne utilized the annexed territory as a base of operations for his decisive military actions against the Avars, a nomadic confederation whose power centered on the Pannonian plain. The systematic destruction of the Avar Khaganate between 791 and 803 AD spearheaded from the newly absorbed Bavarian territory, neutralized the most significant external threat the region had faced, thereby justifying the dissolution of the old Bavarian authority in the eyes of the remaining local aristocracy. The lands were definitively transformed from a semi-autonomous principality into a subordinate, yet vital, Carolingian province. Following the dismantling of the Agilolfing Duchy in 788 AD, the former Bavarian territories were immediately repurposed to serve a singular, vital function within the Carolingian Empire: military defense. Although political autonomy was eliminated, the region's strategic indispensability, its role as the easternmost frontier of the Frankish world, was amplified. Charlemagne established the territory as the Eastern March, Ostmark, a contiguous zone of heightened military readiness dedicated to securing the Danube line and the Alpine passes. The primary and most urgent military objective was the neutralization of the Avar Khaganate. This powerful horse-riding confederation posed a chronic threat to the entire Danubian basin, having established large fortified ring camps in the Pannonian plain. The newly annexed Bavarian resources were instrumental in Charlemagne's comprehensive military strategy against the Avars. The campaigns launched between 791 and 803 AD utilized the former ducal territory as a staging ground and logistical funnel. Frankish forces, organized from bases in the Ostmark, systematically dismantled the Avar defences and seized immense hordes of captured wealth, decisively eliminating the Khaganate as a viable military power. With the Avars defeated, the Frankish defence shifted to managing the persistent pressures exerted by the Slavic tribes along the middle and upper Danube. These groups, unlike the Avars, were primarily agricultural and organised into smaller principalities, such as those in Carantania and Bohemia. The military posture of the March was maintained not for grand conquest, but for constant border security and regulation. Defence relied heavily on the construction and maintenance of fortified checkpoints and border garrisons, many of which were integrated into the old Roman castra. Governance of the Ostmark was militarized. The Frankish counts, Grafen, appointed by Charlemagne, were essentially military commanders, responsible not only for administering justice, but also for raising local levies and commanding troops along the shifting frontier. These counts relied on the continued collaboration of the local Bavarian aristocracy, whose families retained detailed, inherited knowledge of the terrain, local manpower, and enemy movements. The new Carolingian system therefore functioned as a layered, unified defence structure, centrally directed from Aachen, but executed using the geographical and human resources of the annexed territory. The long-term effect of this status was a deep militarization of Bavarian society. The continuous state of war readiness and the constant investment in frontier defence meant that martial prowess remained the primary determinant of social status and political power. This strategic function ensured that, despite its political absorption, the territory remained a distinctive, cohesive entity bound together by the shared experience of defending the empire's vital eastern flank. The Ostmark thus served as the essential incubator for the eventual resurgence of Bavarian political identity, fueled by the necessary concentration of military and aristocratic power within the region. The pivotal event defining the political landscape of the mid-9th century was the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, which formally dissolved the unified Carolingian Empire into 3 successor kingdoms. For the former Agilolfing territory, this division placed it squarely within the emerging Kingdom of East Francia, ruled by Louis the German. This structural change immediately reduced the direct control exerted by the distant Frankish court, creating a profound shift in internal power dynamics. Bavaria was no longer merely a Carolingian march. It became a foundational eastern province of a new political entity. Louis the German, facing the immense challenge of organizing his vast eastern domains, found himself preoccupied with defending a lengthy, volatile frontier stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. His administrative focus was necessarily dispersed, which translated directly into a weakening of central oversight within the Bavarian territories. The imperial counts, Grafen, and other appointed officials, previously held in check by the robust oversight of Charlemagne's government, began to operate with greater autonomy. This decentralization of authority empowered the local aristocracy. Families who had retained or successfully acquired large allodial lands, land held without feudal obligation, rapidly consolidated their positions. They capitalized on the crown's distraction to seize control of local judicial rights, exploit the resources of abandoned or decaying royal estates fiscus, and effectively control the monastic properties within their spheres of influence. These families, often those who had served in key military posts in the Ostmark, based their legitimacy on their wealth, their deep regional roots, and their proven capacity for local defense. The necessity of frontier defense remained the singular constant that underpinned this aristocratic resurgence. The continued threat from various Slavic principalities along the border, including the Bohemians and the Moravians, mandated a strong local military response. Since the king's resources were limited and scattered across East Francia, he was forced to rely on the military mobilization provided by the dominant counts. This reliance translated directly into political leverage for these regional magnates, formalizing their military power into administrative and political status. The most significant consequence was the territorialization of aristocratic power. Unlike earlier Carolingian officials who moved frequently, these established families began to view the region as their permanent hereditary domain. Their political survival depended on maintaining local military readiness, which in turn fostered a strong regional identity among their dependents, subjects, and military followers. This gradual accumulation of land, military command, and administrative authority by a small cohort of powerful local families provided the essential pre-ducal infrastructure for the eventual resurgence of the stem Duchy of Bavaria in the following century. The pivotal development that necessitated the creation of a new ducal authority was the emergence of the Magyar invasions beginning in the late 9th century. These incursions, originating from the Pannonian Plain, were not mere border raids, but coordinated military expeditions that systematically targeted the heartland of East Francia. The existing Carolingian administrative structure, relying on a decentralized network of Frankish counts, Grafen, proved utterly inadequate against the speed and tactical mobility of the Magyar light cavalry. The East Frankish kingdom, under its last effective Carolingian ruler, faced collapse due to this sustained external pressure. The profound military failure of the central authority created a power vacuum across the territories that were most severely exposed to the attacks. Into this desperate scenario stepped Luitpold, a powerful and strategically positioned local magnate. Luitpold's authority was rooted in his extensive landholdings, particularly in the Nordgau and Carinthia, which provided him with direct control over significant resources and manpower. He did not inherit an official ducal title, but rather assumed a position of military command based on necessity and demonstrated competence. Luitpold's contribution was a decisive shift away from relying on fragmented comital levies toward establishing a unified regional defense strategy. He successfully reorganized the local military forces, constructing or fortifying defensive strongholds and coordinating tactical responses against the nomadic forces. His proven capacity to protect the lives and property of the inhabitants, a function the crown could no longer guarantee, became the de facto source of his political legitimacy. This leadership was dramatically validated in 907 AD at the Battle of Pressburg, a catastrophic defeat for the East Frankish army. While the royal forces were annihilated, Luitpold perished alongside them, but his decisive role in organizing the defense was undeniable. Following the disaster at Pressburg, the political vacuum in the east was total. Luitpold's son, Arnulf, capitalized on his father's foundational work and military sacrifice. Arnulf successfully persuaded the local Bavarian aristocracy and clergy to recognize his authority not merely as a count, but as a ruler necessary for survival. This regional assembly, acting independently of the weakening central crown, acknowledged Arnulf as Dux, Duke, an ancient title revived to denote a singular, supreme military commander for the entire region. This event marked the definitive resurgence of the Duchy Stammesherzogtum of Bavaria. The new duchy, founded upon the shared experience of defending the Patria homeland against the Magyars, was fundamentally a military territorial state. Its existence was a direct expression of the local aristocratic class, choosing a regional strongman for protection when the central monarch failed. This collective acknowledgement by the leading figures of the region, the nobility, bishops, and counts, made the resurrected duchy a powerful and cohesive political entity within the fractured remains of East Francia. The acknowledged election of Duke Arnulf in 907 AD fundamentally altered the institutional character of the Bavarian state. The duchy was no longer a personal military command temporarily granted by the Carolingian monarch. It became a corporate political entity, distinct from the crumbling central authority of East Francia. This new Stammesherzogtum, or Stem Duchy, derived its legitimacy not from the king's decree, but from the collective will of the regional aristocracy and the high clergy, the very individuals who had invested Arnulf with the ducal title. This shift marks the resurrection of a powerful, permanent aristocratic state. Arnulf immediately moved to solidify this newfound autonomy by appropriating key royal prerogatives that had been administered by the Carolingian regime. He systematically seized control of the royal estate's fiscus within the ducal boundaries, thereby placing immense landed wealth directly into the ducal treasury. Furthermore, he claimed the right to manage the bishoprics and monasteries, integrating these ecclesiastical resources into his defense and financial planning, effectively overriding the residual authority of the crown in these matters. Crucially, the duchy was politically defined by territorial allegiance rather than fragmented tribal descent. While the term Bavaria still held cultural resonance, the loyalty that mattered was adherence to the duke as the protector of the Bavarian patria, extending across the entire geographical domain from the Lech River eastward. This territorial focus cemented the duchy's status as a distinct, unified administrative unit, capable of mobilizing resources across its entire breadth for a common purpose, namely, defense against the ongoing Magyar onslaughts. Arnulf's assertiveness was so pronounced that he operated with the independence of a king. He concluded foreign treaties with neighboring powers, levied regional customs and tariffs, and issued ducally sanctioned charters without seeking approval from the East Frankish king, who at this point was often a minor or politically weak. This period established the defining constitutional conflict of the next 3 centuries. The inherent tension between the empire's claim to centralized universal authority and the Stem Duchy's fierce, proven right to self-governance rooted in historical precedent and military necessity. The consequence was the entrenchment of a powerful ducal dynasty, the Luitpoldings, whose authority became increasingly hereditary. They successfully created a political identity centered on their unique role as the irreplaceable shields of the eastern frontier. By successfully defending the region and managing its internal affairs when the crown could not, they secured the enduring loyalty of the Bavarian nobility, effectively institutionalizing a political entity whose powers, though often challenged by emperors, remained fundamentally independent in spirit and function. The decisive turning point for all of East Francia, and specifically for the precarious existence of the Bavarian Stem Duchy, occurred at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD. This engagement, where King Otto I of East Francia secured a definitive victory over the Hungarian forces, eliminated the existential threat that had necessitated the resurgence of the Stammesherzogtum under the Luitpoldings. With the external menace neutralized, the constitutional justification for the Duke's near-sovereign authority, the absolute need for local unified defense, was significantly diminished, allowing the crown to reassert its influence. Otto I, who would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 962 AD, immediately recognized the enduring strategic value of Bavaria. The duchy controlled the key Alpine approaches to Italy and maintained the entire southeastern flank of his nascent empire. Therefore, Otto's policy shifted from merely tolerating Bavarian autonomy to aggressively integrating it into the imperial power structure. His primary method for achieving this was the practice of dynastic appointment. The imperial court, having observed the Luitpolding family's repeated defiance, ceased granting the ducal title based on local aristocratic selection. Instead, Otto and his successors consistently installed close members of the royal house brothers, sons, or politically loyal nephews as Dukes of Bavaria. This move served a critical function. It replaced the Luitpolding tradition of local regional loyalty with a system of imperial kinship. The Duke now owed his title, lands, and allegiance directly and personally to the Emperor, ensuring that the duchy's vast resources and military manpower could be channeled back into imperial campaigns and foreign policy goals. This appointment policy fundamentally transformed the ducal office. While the Dukes still commanded the regional military and enjoyed immense local prestige, the position became a revolving post, dependent entirely on the emperor's favour rather than the hereditary claims of a local Bavarian family. This measure was designed to prevent any single aristocratic family from building up permanent, generational power that could once again challenge central authority. The Bavarian aristocracy, though possessing substantial personal wealth, found their ability to influence the succession drastically curtailed by this imperial prerogative. Furthermore, Otto I systematically employed the church as a counterweight to secular ducal power. The emperor strengthened the position of major Bavarian bishoprics and abbeys, granting them extensive immunities and regalian rights usually reserved for the crown, effectively creating pockets of imperial control directly within the ducal territory. These ecclesiastical princes, who relied on the emperor for their titles and protection, became steadfast supporters of the Ottonian system, complicating the duke's administrative reach and financial control over the entire duchy. This strategic policy aimed at maintaining tight central control over the vital eastern flank, even as it set the stage for generations of intense internal conflict between the local ducal government and the privileged, imperial-backed ecclesiastical estates. The history of the Duchy of Bavaria in the late 10th century is overwhelmingly dominated by the figure of Henry II, known as der Senker, or the Wrangler, whose protracted conflict with the imperial authority defined an era of intense political instability. Henry's political pedigree as a member of the Ottonian house itself gave his defiance a particularly dangerous edge. He was challenging his own kinsman who occupied the throne of East Francia and later the Holy Roman Empire. His ambition was not merely to administer the duchy, but to restore its sovereign independence, reclaiming the powers exercised by the Luitpolding dukes prior to the Ottonian consolidation. Henry's struggle was multifaceted and spanned the reigns of several emperors. His first major act of insubordination occurred during the minority of Otto II, when he directly challenged the regent's authority, leading to his first deposition and subsequent imprisonment. This established a critical precedent. The Bavarian ducal office was now a political pawn in the high stakes of imperial dynastic politics, subject to arbitrary removal by the crown. Upon his restoration, Henry intensified his efforts to forge independent power bases, focusing on strategic alliances with external rivals of the empire, most notably the Duchy of Bohemia and certain Slavic principalities along the eastern frontier. These alliances, concluded without imperial assent, aimed to create a robust military and diplomatic bloc capable of resisting the central authority. The nature of Henry's rebellion was constitutional, directly attacking the imperial system that used the duchy as a territorial asset. He claimed hereditary right to the duchy, directly contravening the Ottonian policy that insisted on imperial appointment. This defiance came to a climax after the death of Otto II, when Henry the Wrangler attempted to seize the imperial throne itself. He claimed the regency over the infant heir, Otto III, and secured the support of numerous discontented nobles and bishops, including those from other stem duchies eager to see the central authority weakened. This aggressive move plunged the empire into a major internal civil war. Though ultimately unsuccessful in his bid for the crown, Henry's relentless political maneuvering forced the imperial line to make tactical compromises. The constant drain on imperial resources caused by the necessity of campaigning against Henry's Bavarian armies in multiple theatres, was enormous. His resistance illustrated the persistent, deep-seated separatist tendencies of the Bavarian nobility and the inherent challenge in integrating the duchy fully into the centralized Ottonian state. Even after his final surrender and restoration, a recurring pattern in his career, the tradition of uncompromising opposition to imperial overreach, had become deeply ingrained in the regional political consciousness. Henry's reign ensured that the Dukes of Bavaria, regardless of their family ties to the emperor, would be viewed with suspicion by the crown. The duchy remained a pivotal trouble spot, its resources and men often withheld from critical imperial campaigns in Italy due to local instability orchestrated by Henry or his supporters. His legacy was the institutionalization of the Duke as the primary advocate for regional autonomy against the centralized power of the emperor, shaping Bavarian domestic and foreign policy for centuries. The fundamental identity of the Bavarian stem duchy was inextricably linked to its position as the primary frontier defense of the German kingdom. Throughout the 10th and 11th centuries, the duchy was in constant, often violent, contact with emerging polities to the east, making the entire political structure a militarized zone. The necessity of maintaining this expansive, volatile border created a distinct social and political reality where military capability trumped other forms of influence. The principal eastern neighbours were the newly established Duchy of Bohemia and the various less centralized Slavic territories spanning the modern Austrian and Slovenian regions. Bohemia, under the Christianized dynasty, was consolidating its power and seeking to extend its influence west into the Bavarian sphere, leading to incessant border skirmishes and disputes over strategic fortifications. Control of river courses and defensible mountain passes was a constant source of military mobilization for both sides. The Slavs, while often fragmented, posed a continuous threat through raids and small-scale territorial encroachments that demanded permanent ducal garrisons and organized local militias. This perpetual state of conflict had a profound constitutional effect. It validated and continuously reinforced the military authority of the Duke and the regional aristocracy. The Duke, regardless of his relationship with the Emperor, functioned as the indispensable supreme military commander dux, the sole figure capable of coordinating large-scale defensive and offensive operations. This role ensured the Duke's enduring legitimacy in the eyes of the Bavarian noble caste, whose own power derived from their capacity to raise and lead troops in these campaigns. The local Bavarian nobility evolved into a distinct military aristocracy hardened by generations of frontier service. Their wealth and status were tied less to inherited titles within the imperial court, and more to the successful acquisition of war booty, new territories carved out of the Slavic marches, and the military retinues, milites, they maintained at their private castles. This warrior mentality fostered a fierce independence among the nobles, making them habitually resistant to centralized authority, whether ducal or imperial, which they perceived as distant and ineffective in handling immediate frontier threats. The continuous military expeditions also served as the primary vehicle for German eastward expansion, the Ostsiedlung, which was a decentralized, violent, and often commercially motivated process. Bavarian counts and bishops organized the establishment of new military marches border districts, notably the March of Austria, Osterici, which were initially under the direct political and military control of Bavarian nobles. These new territories, though technically detached from the duchy's core, were inextricably linked by dynastic ties and military dependence, effectively making the Bavarian aristocracy the chief colonizers and political architects of the southeastern empire. This intense focus on the eastern border defined the duchy as a political entity perpetually on a war footing, ensuring its domestic politics remained dominated by the power of the sword. The conflict beginning in the late 11th century between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV over the right to appoint high church officials, the investiture controversy, provided the Bavarian aristocracy with an unprecedented opportunity for political and economic gain. This titanic struggle over Dominium Mundi did not manifest as clear-cut theological debate in the duchy, but rather as a highly effective secular land grab. The prolonged absence of the emperor from German lands, coupled with the excommunication of Henry IV, created a systemic breakdown in central imperial authority that the regional powers immediately exploited. Bavaria became a primary theatre for this constitutional conflict, largely because the ducal office itself became a weapon in the fight. When Henry IV formally forfeited the duchy in 1070 after its incumbent, Otto of Nordheim, rebelled, the title was granted to the Welf family, a rising noble lineage from Swabia. This political maneuver instantly installed a figure who was fundamentally anti-Salian and strongly allied with the papal Saxon opposition, thereby embedding the imperial crisis deep within the Bavarian administrative structure. The resulting internal division was not purely ideological, rather it was a practical tool used by local counts and lesser lords to accumulate power and wealth. The most profound long-term consequence was the comprehensive secularization of church assets. Monasteries, bishoprics, and wealthy collegiate churches, which were traditionally directly under imperial or ducal protection, suddenly found their charters and property rights unenforceable. Local families, aligned either with the emperor and claiming the right to enforce imperial decrees, or with the pope, and acting as protectors of the reform movement, used the endemic warfare to seize lands and judicial rights over these ecclesiastical territories. The ancient Bavarian noble families, recognizing that the crisis might be prolonged indefinitely, began to systematically build territorial blocks outside the duke's effective reach. They annexed former immunities, consolidated smaller allodial holdings, and brought previously free tenants, free peasants, under their direct judicial control. This shift represented the decisive acceleration towards territorial lordship, Landesherrschaft, where sovereignty became concentrated in the hands of regional magnates, rather than remaining vested in the distant, weakened crown or the embattled ducal authority. Furthermore, the Welf's successful acquisition of the duchy established them as the new dominant aristocratic dynasty in the region, displacing other contenders and positioning them for their later role as protagonists in the greater struggles of the High Middle Ages. The resolution of the conflict through the Concordat of Worms did little to reverse this local decentralization. The newly secularized powers and fragmented property rights remained firmly in the grasp of the local Bavarian elite. The acquisition of the ducal title by the Welf dynasty in the late 11th century marked a fundamental pivot in the history of Bavaria, permanently integrating the duchy into the highest level of imperial and European dynastic conflict. This pivotal moment occurred when the territory was effectively seized from the rebellious Otto of Nordheim and handed to Welf I. The Welfs were not an indigenous Bavarian family, but rather a powerful, newly installed lineage originating from Swabia. Their elevation instantly transformed Bavaria from a stem duchy, Stammesherzogtum, rooted in local tribal tradition, to the dynastic cornerstone of one of the empire's two competing mega-factions. The primary significance of the Welf rule was their role as protagonists in the protracted Guelph-Ghibelline rivalry. The Welfs became the enduring leaders of the papal-leaning faction, Guelphs, against the imperial-supporting Hohenstaufen dynasty, Ghibellines. This rivalry was not merely ideological, it was a century-long struggle for control over the imperial throne and resources, using Bavaria as a military and logistical base for their operations. The ducal seat in Bavaria became the dynastic capital from which the Welfs launched their challenges and consolidated their political power, drawing other anti-imperial nobles into their sphere of influence. The geographical reach of the Welfs extended far beyond the duchy's borders. Through strategic marriages and inheritance, the Welfs secured vast allodial holdings stretching into Swabia and northern Italy. This territorial breadth provided a deep reserve of manpower, revenue, and political weight, making them the most formidable aristocratic threat to imperial centralization in the 12th century. The sheer scale of their territorial holdings meant that Welf power could mobilize opposition to the emperor from multiple geographical points simultaneously. Domestically, wealth governance continued the process of centralized aristocratic control. They relied heavily on the construction of strategic ministerialia, unfree, appointed knights, to manage their dispersed territories and enforce ducal authority, effectively circumventing the rebellious tendencies of the native Bavarian magnates. They utilized their position to aggressively challenge the political and commercial privileges of the powerful prince-bishops, striving to establish the duke as the undisputed source of all secular jurisdiction, Landeshoheit, within the duchy. The Welf era institutionalized the concept of the Bavarian duke as a figure of supranational importance. This period saw the duchy contribute disproportionately to the empire's political crises, with battles and diplomatic maneuvers orchestrated from Bavarian soil having direct ramifications in Italy and across the entire German kingdom. Thus, the ascendancy of the Welfs permanently altered the duchy's political DNA, establishing it as a primary, non-negotiable power centre tied directly to the fate of the Holy Roman Empire itself. The Welf tenure in Bavaria, particularly under the reign of Henry X, the Proud, in the early 12th century, witnessed the duchy's influence reach its maximal territorial extent and political ambition. This expansion was not achieved through large-scale conquest, but through meticulous dynastic strategy. The Welfs systematically used marriage alliances to merge existing ducal rights and titles with their immense Swabian allodial holdings, effectively creating a sprawling and strategically crucial power block that straddled the entire southern German landscape. This territorial zenith was confirmed when Henry X also inherited the Duchy of Saxony through his mother. This union of Bavaria and Saxony in one hand presented an unprecedented accumulation of feudal power, a massive block stretching from the Baltic Sea down to the Alps that directly threatened to eclipse the authority of the imperial throne itself. This geographic reality immediately transformed Henry X into the single most dangerous internal rival, facing the newly installed Hohenstaufen Emperor Conrad III. The Welf strategy of expansion was not merely focused on ducal holdings. They also actively extended their power over the numerous prince-bishoprics within and bordering Bavaria. By utilizing their influence in local capitular elections and challenging imperial nominees, the Welfs effectively captured control over the immense resources and jurisdictions of key sees, including Salzburg, Freising, and Passau. This control gave them authority over vast ecclesiastical territories and vital alpine trade routes that linked northern Europe directly to the Lombard cities of northern Italy. Furthermore, the Welfs successfully leveraged their position in the ongoing imperial disputes to acquire new Reichsrechte, imperial rights, and privileges, formalizing their decentralized authority. Their successful establishment of new market towns and administrative centers enhanced their revenue streams and created dependent urban populations that owed allegiance directly to the ducal house, thus bypassing older aristocratic and imperial jurisdictions. This process cemented the family's control over the regional economy. The result of this century of careful consolidation was the formation of a contiguous territorial entity. Although feudal structures meant that the land was not governed uniformly, the Welfs wielded the collective economic, military, and political weight of a single massive state within the Holy Roman Empire. This massive centralization of power ultimately became intolerable to the imperial government. The Hohenstaufens correctly viewed this Welf territorial bloc as a structural impediment to any form of centralized imperial governance, setting the stage for the inevitable confrontation that would lead to the drastic fragmentation of the duchy. The establishment of territorial sovereignty, known in jurisprudence as Landeshoheit, defined the most protracted conflict within the medieval Duchy of Bavaria. This struggle was waged between the increasingly centralized authority of the dukes and the deeply entrenched temporal power of the prince-bishops. The ecclesiastical estates, particularly the powerful sees of Freising, Salzburg, and Passau, functioned effectively as independent principalities, controlling vast tracts of land, maintaining private armies, and exercising full judicial rights over their subjects. The dukes, determined to unify the various fragmented jurisdictions under a singular secular crown, identified these church holdings as the greatest impediment to consolidating the ducal state. The primary legal battleground was the institution of advocacy, Vogtei. Traditionally, the duke acted as the secular protector, Vogt, of church property, a duty that carried the right to collect specific military and administrative fees. Dukes systematically leveraged this legal function, transforming it from a protective service into a tool of direct financial extraction and political dominance. They appointed their own loyal ministerialia as sub-advocates, effectively taking over the secular administration of wealthy monasteries like Tegernsee and Ebersberg, and integrating their revenues directly into the ducal treasury. This aggressive takeover led to chronic, often violent, local confrontations. The bishops vigorously resisted, citing papal privileges and imperial charters granted since the Ottonian era that affirmed their full temporal immunity. Disputes frequently centered on the right to exercise high justice, criminal jurisdiction, including the death penalty, over peasants residing on church lands. When the ducal courts asserted this right, the bishops would excommunicate the offending ducal officials, triggering cycles of religious sanction and military retaliation. The conflict was rarely settled by pitched battle, but rather by persistent legal and bureaucratic maneuvering. Beyond jurisdiction, the economic friction was intense. The church often possessed exclusive rights to strategically valuable resources, including tolls levied on river traffic and roads, as well as crucial mining privileges related to copper, silver, and salt extraction. The duke's attempts to seize or regulate these monopolies were met with documented resistance, demonstrating the economic independence of the ecclesiastical establishment. This ceaseless pressure over who ultimately controlled the land, resources, and people the duke or the bishop forced the Wittelsbachs to adopt a strategy of gradual, meticulous administrative erosion rather than large-scale military confrontation. The ultimate failure of the dukes to fully subjugate the most powerful prince-bishoprics during this period resulted in the duchy remaining a politically fragmented territory well into the later Middle Ages. While the dukes did successfully establish their Landeshoheit over purely secular nobles, the continued autonomy of the spiritual territories meant that Bavaria existed not as a unified state, but as a dense cluster of overlapping and often hostile jurisdictions. This enduring reality ensured that the process of state formation remained incomplete, perpetually demanding the attention and resources of every subsequent ducal regime. The year 1180 AD marks the most drastic political restructuring of the Duchy of Bavaria since the Carolingian absorption, 4 centuries prior. This definitive reckoning was precipitated by the irreconcilable conflict between the Welf Duke Henry the Lion and his cousin, the Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa. Henry's staggering concentration of power controlling both the vast duchies of Bavaria and Saxony, along with immense allodial holdings, was correctly identified by the imperial court as an existential threat to the central authority of the Reich. The immediate pretext for Henry's downfall was his persistent refusal to provide military support for Barbarossa's Italian campaign in 1176. This deliberate withholding of essential feudal duty, the Heeresvolk, constituted a breach of imperial law and provided the emperor with the legal leverage he desperately needed. The legal proceedings initiated against Henry were held under a series of imperial diets, assemblies, culminating in the final verdict delivered at the Diet of Gelnhausen. In this formal judgment, the emperor declared Henry guilty of contumacy, disobedience to a summons, and formally stripped him of all his imperial fiefs. The resulting legal and political execution of Henry the Lion had immediate and profound consequences for the territorial configuration of Bavaria. The extensive, contiguous territorial bloc the Welfs had painstakingly constructed was ruthlessly dissolved. The imperial decree explicitly separated the Duchy of Bavaria from the Duchy of Saxony, ending the century-long union of the 2 greatest stem duchies under a single familial hand. This separation instantly reduced the Welf domain to manageable, isolated pieces. Barbarossa immediately reorganized the former Bavarian territory. The most strategically valuable southern and eastern districts were detached to form new, independent political entities. The entire area encompassing the later Duchy of Styria and the core of the Austrian March were elevated to independent ducal status and handed to the loyal Babenberg dynasty. This single action dramatically redrew the map, shrinking Bavaria to its core peninsula north of the Alps, and simultaneously creating two powerful new imperial principalities on the former Bavarian frontier. The remnant of Bavaria was then immediately awarded to Otto I of the House of Wittelsbach. Unlike the powerful, globe-trotting Welfs, the Wittelsbachs were a local Bavarian comital family whose primary virtue in the emperor's eyes was their unwavering feudal loyalty during the protracted conflict. Otto I received the shrunken duchy as a completely new imperial grant, marking the beginning of a dynasty that would rule the territory for over 700 years. This event, therefore, represents not merely the end of the Welf era, but the political birth of the later Bavarian state within its now drastically reduced, but more structurally unified, boundaries. The outcome of the imperial judgment delivered in the Reich assemblies constituted a complete deconstruction of the political inheritance built since the time of the Luitpoldings. This profound territorial amputation effectively ended the Stammesherzogtum, or Stem Duchy, as a historical entity defined by overarching tribal allegiance and vast geographical span. The ruling dynasty was expelled, and the imperial government exercised its ultimate prerogative to redraw internal political boundaries without seeking consent from the local aristocracy. The most significant immediate effect was the definitive hiving off of the eastern territories. The extensive frontier zones, which had historically been the source of Bavarian military strength and eastward colonization, were now organized into high-ranking, non-Bavarian principalities. The Carinthian March, a crucial zone of alpine influence and mineral wealth, was formally detached from the main duchy and reorganized under a separate ducal line, removing the Bavarian hand from the South Slavic periphery. The previously cohesive administrative structure of the old duchy was shattered, yielding permanent political division. The emperor confirmed the elevation of the Pannonian borderlands to a sovereign duchy, granting it to a favored imperial house. This creation of the Duchy of Austria solidified a powerful rival state directly on Bavaria's exposed eastern flank, fundamentally altering the military balance in the southeast German realm. The loss was strategic. It included the control of the Enns River line and numerous strategically vital fortresses and monastic estates in the region, resources that would never return to Munich's jurisdiction. The consequences were institutional as well as geographic. The ducal title bestowed upon the new ruling family was dramatically diminished in scope. The old dukes of the previous house had directly controlled most of the key counties, Gau, and exercised extensive regalian rights across the entire territory. Following the 1180 dissolution, the surviving duchy concentrated primarily around the confluence of the Lech, Isar, and Inn, was smaller and fractured by the independent territories of the powerful prince-bishops, whose immunities remained untouched by the imperial decree. The duke was simply one powerful figure among many. The political fragmentation was intentional. Barbarossa aimed to prevent any future regional magnate from accumulating the sort of transnational power that had allowed the Welfs to defy him. By dividing the territory and handing portions to rival families, he ensured that the successor state would remain weak and dependent. The rump territory of Bavaria was thus forced to begin a lengthy, difficult process of internal territorial consolidation, known as Landesausbau, merely to establish control over its remaining fragmented core. This reality defined the entire subsequent political program of the new dynasty. The catastrophic dissolution of the Welf hegemony in 1180 immediately conferred the ducal title upon Otto I of the House of Wittelsbach. This granting of the ducal dignity was a direct political maneuver by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, designed not to reward exceptional merit, but to permanently fragment power and install a family with a clear history of feudal subservience. The Wittelsbachs were not a transnational dynasty like the Welfs. They were a long-established, prominent lineage of local Bavarian counts, whose primary ancestral seat lay at Cheyenne. Their ascent was thus entirely contingent upon the specific politics of the imperial Welf dispute, providing a profound example of how external conflicts dictated the trajectory of the duchy. Otto I inherited a territory dramatically reduced in size and political coherence. He was granted the Rump Duchy, which was essentially a core administrative area surrounded by recently elevated, hostile, or newly independent political entities. The primary challenge facing the new dynasty was institutional. The ducal title itself was, at this point, highly symbolic, as the actual substance of governance territorial control, rights over peasants, and the collection of local fees remained dispersed among numerous competing jurisdictions. The Wittelsbachs began their rule with no direct control over the vast new duchies of Austria and Styria, nor the vital Alpine passes they once claimed. Their initial strategy was one of meticulous territorial expansion and rights acquisition through focused economic policy rather than large-scale warfare. Lacking the immense resources of the deposed Welfs, the Wittelsbachs relied on strategic land swaps, carefully orchestrated marriage alliances, and the aggressive purchase of fragmented comital rights from lesser nobles struggling with debt. This systematic, grinding work of consolidating the disparate territorial pieces is known as Landesausbau and became the hallmark of their early governance. A critical fiscal tool utilized by the first dukes was the leveraging of their newly acquired sovereign rights, specifically regalian privileges such as the right to coin money and levy tolls. The revenues generated from custom stations and the control of key commercial routes within the diminished core area were immediately invested back into securing more land and building out a loyal administration composed of professional ministerialia. This economic foundation allowed them to replace the old system of scattered feudal allegiances with a more centralized structure of direct ducal control. Furthermore, the dynasty established its primary seat of power, developing the small settlement of München into a pivotal commercial and administrative center. This strategic investment in a centralized hub, distinct from older ecclesiastical capitals like Freising, provided the logistical and financial base necessary for the centuries-long process of building a coherent state. This unexpected elevation of the Wittelsbachs, sustained by their consistent ability to acquire and consolidate disparate local properties and privileges, began a dynastic reign that fundamentally shaped the history of the entire region for over 700 years. The primary ambition defining the governance of the successor dynasty was the relentless pursuit of Landesherrschaft, a term denoting the exclusive territorial sovereignty of the prince within his borders. This political objective required the dismantling of all competing sources of authority that had proliferated during the previous centuries of imperial and feudal fragmentation. The dukes undertook this project with cold legalism, focusing on two main spheres of opposition: the independent secular nobility and the vast, politically entrenched ecclesiastical landholders. Against the scattered comital houses and local baronial families, the strategy involved more aggressive legal maneuvers than simple purchase. The duchy's legal apparatus actively exploited the extinction of noble lineages, rigorously asserting reversion rights, Heimfallsrecht, over defunct fiefs. Where a noble line failed to produce an heir, the ducal administration ensured the property and all associated jurisdictional rights reverted immediately and completely to the ducal domain, preventing them from being redistributed by the emperor or seized by rival lords. Military pressure was also applied through the systematic construction of ducal castles, Amtsburgen, strategically placed, not on the border, but within the heart of territories claimed by autonomous nobles, physically constraining their movements and challenging their local judicial supremacy. The challenge posed by the powerful prince-bishoprics was structural, demanding institutional rather than military solutions. The Wittelsbach rulers employed clerics and university-trained legalists to challenge the bishops' secular immunitätsbezirke, immunities, in ducal courts. They successfully transferred many administrative functions, such as supervising weights, measures, and infrastructure maintenance from the religious houses to the nascent ducal bureaucracy. This erosion of episcopal secular competence was vital. It preserved the Church's spiritual role while stripping away its temporal political jurisdiction, incorporating the management of lucrative church assets into the ducal fiscal framework. Central to this consolidation was the formal creation of a central state administration. The ducal chancery evolved from a simple clerical office into a professional, permanent organ of government, staffed by officials trained in Roman and canon law. This intellectual expertise allowed the dukes to issue binding territorial ordinances that applied uniformly across the entire duchy, superseding the disparate local customs and privileges previously enjoyed by individual feudal lords. The judicial system was similarly standardized. The ducal Hofgericht, court of the palace, was established as the supreme judicial authority, replacing the local personal justice administered by counts. Appeals to this high court systematically undermined the legal standing of all lower jurisdictions. Financially, the dynasty secured its independence by creating permanent administrative organs dedicated solely to ducal revenue. A key innovation was the salt monopoly, a rigorous state control over the highly profitable trade and extraction of salt, generating reliable income, disconnected from the volatile yields of feudal levies or agricultural cycles. These revenues were managed by specialized treasuries, such as the Rentenkammer, establishing a permanent state treasury apparatus. This creation of a functionally unified legal, financial, and administrative framework transformed the fragmented territories into a cohesive princely state capable of unified action, a necessary predecessor to modern statehood. The political success achieved by the Wittelsbach house in the decades immediately following their investiture was built upon a precarious foundation of Germanic customary law. While they demonstrated an aptitude for territorial centralization, they failed to adopt the crucial principle of undivided inheritance utilized by many contemporary monarchies. This negligence regarding a fixed succession protocol proved to be the Achilles heel of the burgeoning princely state. Upon the death of Duke Otto II in 1253, the duchy was plunged into an existential crisis concerning its future political structure. His two surviving sons, Louis II and Henry XIII, were heirs presumptive under a system that traditionally required the division of the patrimony among male siblings. Despite the recent history demonstrating the critical need for a unified territorial base, the brothers, driven by dynastic equality and personal ambition, enforced this custom. This culminated in the Landesteilungsbeschluss of 1255, a formal legal instrument that fundamentally dissolved the recently consolidated duchy. This act created two entirely separate and politically distinct regimes. Duke Louis II received Upper Bavaria, Oberbayern. This portion comprised the areas west of the Isar River, including the city of Munich, the principal Alpine passes, and scattered possessions in the Upper Palatinate. Its resources were characterized by relative political complexity and fragmented jurisdiction inherited from the older western counties. Duke Henry XIII inherited Lower Bavaria, Niederbayern. This eastern half consisted of the more cohesive territory between the Isar and Inn rivers, centered on the newly developing economic hub of Landshut, which became its capital. Its revenues were generally drawn from more straightforward agricultural exploitation and control over key Danubian trade points. The immediate functional impact of this dual rule was the complete duplication of governmental infrastructure. Two entirely separate administrative bodies were instituted, each requiring its own ducal court, treasury, and bureaucratic staff. This development, previously unnecessary, doubled the cost of governance and substantially strained the revenue base of the smaller successor states. Furthermore, the extensive rights and properties that the early dukes had painstakingly unified assets crucial for asserting territorial dominance were once again fractionalized. Jurisdiction over strategically important market towns and shared financial assets had to be painfully divided or managed through complicated temporary bilateral agreements. The partition instantly engendered dynastic hostility. The two courts, operating in close geographic proximity, inevitably became rivals, leading to recurrent border disputes and open, localized military engagements over contested privileges and properties. This internal conflict severely degraded the military efficiency of the Bavarian polity, diverting resources and manpower away from defending the vulnerable eastern frontiers. Instead of facing external threats, the dukes were preoccupied with internal fraternal power struggles. The 1,255 division, therefore, represents a catastrophic reversal of the consolidation policies, initiating centuries of debilitating Wittelsbach dynastic fragmentation that kept the ducal state perpetually weak in imperial affairs. The disastrous Landesteilungsbeschluss of 1255 initiated a protracted era of dynastic dissolution that defined the political landscape of Bavaria for the subsequent 2 centuries. The absence of a formal, legally binding primogeniture doctrine within the Wittelsbach house meant that virtually every generation that produced multiple male heirs triggered an automatic and often hostile repartition of the ducal patrimony. This adherence to the ancestral Germanic principle of shared inheritance completely negated the centralization efforts undertaken by the previous rulers and ensured perpetual political instability. This continuous fragmentation led to the establishment of numerous short-lived, geographically complex, and financially dependent mini-states. Following the initial division into Upper and Lower Bavaria, further partitions created ephemeral entities such as Bavaria Straubing, Bavaria Landshut, Bavaria Ingolstadt, and Bavaria Munich. These were not culturally distinct regions, but administrative subdivisions constantly shifting their borders based on the survival, marriage, or death of individual dukes. The result was a political geography that resembled a jurisdictional mosaic, characterized by non-contiguous landholdings, shared sovereignty over vital assets, and overlapping feudal claims. The economic consequences of this Zersplitterung fragmentation were profound. Each ducal branch, regardless of its size, was compelled to maintain a full apparatus of state, including its own chancery, supreme court, and treasury. This multiplication of administrative overhead dramatically increased the financial burden on the peasant and urban populations, as multiple courts levied taxes on territories that were often barely solvent. Resources that should have been invested in unified infrastructure development or external defense were instead consumed by maintaining the prestige and bureaucratic staff of 4 or more rival ducal courts. Furthermore, the military capacity of the Bavarian polity was severely degraded. Instead of presenting a unified front to the empire or to external rivals like the Hussites, the Wittelsbach dukes were primarily engaged in interducal warfare and intricate diplomatic maneuvering against their own cousins. The historical records are replete with instances of formalized feuds and territorial skirmishes arising from contested castles, inheritance rights, or the control of lucrative customs stations. These internal conflicts drained noble manpower and prevented any coherent strategy for expanding the duchy's influence or recovering the strategically vital territories lost in 1180. The period was marked by a complex web of shifting fraternal alliances and betrayals. A Duke of Bavaria Munich might enter into a military league with a foreign power such as the Emperor or a neighboring bishop to gain leverage against his cousin in Bavaria Landshut, only to dissolve the alliance shortly thereafter. This internal preoccupation rendered the Bavarian state effectively impotent in major imperial politics throughout the 14th and early 15th centuries. While other German princely houses were consolidating power and gaining electoral status, the Wittelsbachs remained paralyzed by the debilitating effects of their own rigid adherence to outdated inheritance customs. The cumulative effect of this century of fratricide was the perpetual weakness of a territory fundamentally designed for unified rule. The protracted Wittelsbach dynastic fragmentation, while debilitating to the duchy's central political authority, paradoxically coincided with a period of unprecedented commercial and urban growth across the wider German sphere. The sheer volume of traffic traversing the fragmented territories ensured that commerce remained an indispensable and resilient force, structurally strengthening the region despite its divided leadership. Bavaria became the central transit point, connecting the financial sophistication and luxury markets of northern Italy with the essential raw materials of the German, Bohemian and Slavic lands to the north and east. The most prominent beneficiary of this strategic position was Regensburg. Situated directly on the Danube River, the city monopolized the crucial east-west trade axis. Goods originating from the Black Sea and the Byzantine sphere, such as furs and honey, flowed up the Danube, while manufactured goods, particularly cloth from Flanders and metals, travelled eastward. Regensburg acted as the obligatory transshipment point, controlling tolls and customs duties that generated massive capital for its merchant class and its resident prince. The city's wealth was evidenced by its autonomous status as a free imperial city, Reichsstadt, a jurisdiction that separated it from the direct control of the surrounding ducal territories. Further south, Munich ascended in importance by anchoring the north-south axis. Its strategic location on the Isar River allowed it to control the profitable salt trade coming from the Reichenhall region and, more importantly, the flow of capital and high-value textiles crossing the Alps via the Brenner Pass. Munich's direct economic ties to Venice and Augsburg channeled Italian banking practices and mercantile innovation directly into the heart of the duchy. The ducal branch based in Munich, particularly Bavaria Munich, increasingly relied upon the city's tax base, fostering its growth and shielding it from the most destructive effects of the interducal feuds. The financial systems that supported this massive exchange also became more sophisticated. The influx of Italian finance, particularly the services provided by Florentine and Venetian banking houses, allowed the formation of complex credit instruments and long-distance commercial partnerships. Bohemian silver and copper from the eastern Alpine mines provided the necessary metallic currency and commodities for international exchange. Consequently, the commercial class, the burghers and patriciate of these cities accrued significant wealth and demanded greater political influence within their respective ducal fragments, often leading to confrontations with the financially precarious ducal courts. Even the smaller ducal seats, such as Landshut and Straubing, benefited by leveraging their control over regional customs barriers, Zolla. Despite the political inefficiencies, the overall GNP of the territories remained robust, primarily because the essential geography of trade could not be circumvented by internal political borders. This commercial prosperity served as the economic ballast that prevented the complete political collapse of the Wittelsbach lands, ensuring that when reunification finally became politically feasible, the underlying fiscal capacity for a unified state was still present and thriving. The protracted Wittelsbach dynastic fragmentation, which had debilitated the duchy since the 1255 partition, was finally brought to a decisive conclusion in the early 16th century through a combination of extinction, diplomacy, and legal innovation. The relentless cycle of division had reached its climax with the Landshut War of Succession, 1503, 1505, a devastating conflict sparked by the death of the Duke of Bavaria Landshut without immediate legitimate male heirs. This war, primarily fought between the surviving Munich line and the Palatinate Wittelsbach branch, revealed the extreme fragility of the fragmented political structure and the inherent danger it posed to the stability of the entire empire. The conflict was ultimately resolved in 1505 under the arbitration of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. The settlement granted the majority of the disputed Landshut territory to Duke Albert IV of the Bavaria-Munich line. This resolution effectively eliminated the separate Bavaria-Landshut and Bavaria-Ingolstadt lines, which were either extinct or forcibly absorbed. The result was a dramatic territorial consolidation, reducing the complex matrix of principalities into a single, unified political entity for the first time in over 2.5 centuries. Recognizing the immense cost and political impotence caused by the earlier partitions, Duke Albert IV immediately moved to implement a permanent solution to prevent any future relapse into fragmentation. In 1506, Albert formally issued the primogeniture law, Einheitsvertrag, declaring the absolute and perpetual indivisibility of the Duchy of Bavaria. This revolutionary legal decree established the principle of absolute male primogeniture for the entire territory. Under this law, the ducal title and all associated lands and rights would henceforth pass in full to the eldest legitimate son, explicitly barring any future division among siblings or collateral lines. This institutional change marked the definitive end of the medieval stem duchy model, replacing old customary inheritance practices with a modern legal foundation necessary for an effective princely state. Fürstenstaat. The newly unified territory was characterized by improved administrative efficiency. The multiple chancelleries and courts that had been a fiscal burden for generations were dissolved, leading to the streamlining of tax collection and the centralization of sovereign rights, Landeshoheit. The political effect was immediate. The combined resources, revenues, and military manpower of the whole Bavarian territory could now be mobilized under a single administration. This fiscal and military centralization allowed the Wittelsbach house to assert a new level of influence in imperial affairs, moving from a collection of minor, perpetually feuding princes to a powerful, singular political voice. The 1506 declaration was therefore not merely a dynastic settlement, but the founding act of the early modern Bavarian state, securing its borders, stabilizing its economy, and concluding the chaotic, fratricidal era of medieval division. The proclamation of the Einheitsvertrag in 1506 inaugurated a new political order, fundamentally distinct from its fragmented medieval predecessor. This decisive legal act establishing perpetual indivisibility fostered a powerful sense of territorial security, allowing the Wittelsbach house to engage in long-term strategic planning previously impossible due to recurrent inheritance crises. The new legal foundation transformed the duchy from a loose aggregation of familial landholdings into a politically and institutionally unified princely state. Administrative modernization immediately followed the legal decree. The establishment of a single, highly centralized ducal chancery, Hofkanzlei, professionalized the administration of justice and governance across the formerly separated territories. Critical to this shift was the creation of a unified court chamber, Hofkammer, which took complete control of all state finances, including customs revenue, domain revenues, and the crucial income derived from the salt monopoly. This centralized fiscal apparatus employed a staff increasingly composed of university-trained jurists and bureaucrats, rather than relying solely on the loyalty and competence of the territorial nobility, thus ensuring a professionalized service class directly accountable to the central ducal authority. This restructuring significantly enhanced the state's capacity for revenue extraction and resource mobilization. By consolidating all financial oversight, the central treasury gained the substantial reserves required to fund the state's ambitions beyond its borders. The territory, now defined by rigid, contiguous boundaries, gained a hardened geopolitical identity, ending the former ambiguity where internal ducal lines often blurred external frontiers. This territorial coherence made the entire state a more effective military and diplomatic player in the Holy Roman Empire. With internal matters settled, the unified state's political energy shifted decisively toward European and imperial politics. Bavaria immediately confronted the profound ideological and military shockwaves of the Protestant Reformation spreading throughout the northern German principalities. The newly centralized state quickly cemented its position as the preeminent, uncompromising Catholic bastion in the empire's southern half, dedicating its fiscal and political weight to the preservation of the old faith. This commitment required a revamped military posture. The centralized budget allowed the Duke to reduce dependence on the traditional, unreliable feudal levies. Instead, the state could maintain small professional mercenary contingents, providing the Duke with the capacity to project power, participate in emerging religious and political leagues, and secure its borders against both external encroachment and internal heresy. The duchy's participation in the complex diplomatic maneuvering leading up to and throughout the great wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries was a direct result of the stability and institutional efficiency achieved by the 1506 unification. Bavaria emerged from its medieval chaos as a prepared, early modern state, ready to defend its confessional alignment and pursue the highest offices in the empire.